Hello and welcome everyone to IAedChat Live. We are continuing to bring you the latest educational news each month, and we are pleased to connect with you tonight. We have a very special guest this evening. Mr. Jim Sporleder is here. He's going to chat with us, and we're going to introduce Jim in just a few minutes. We have a very special guest this evening. Mr. Jim Sporleder is here. He's going to chat with us, and we're going to introduce Jim in just a few minutes. We have a very special guest this evening. Guys, I don't know if you're having any feedback. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback on my end, but hopefully you're not. But as you can see, tonight's chat will have a live video stream, and we will be taking questions from our audience. So please, if you have questions that you would like to ask Jim, submit them via our hashtag on Twitter, which is hashtag IAedChat, and we'll monitor that feed. Do not hesitate to use your voice and share your thoughts that you would like to ask. We will get this podcast or this show on our podcast later tonight. So if you have not checked us out on iTunes or Podomatic, do that. Subscribe to us and give us a rating. We really appreciate your feedback and engagement. Show on our podcast. So we'll start with some introductions. My name is Dan Butler. I am an elementary school principal in Western Dubuque Schools, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Townsley. We'll start with some introductions.
Hey guys, I'm wondering if somebody has the live link open, and I'm wondering if that's where some of the kickback is coming from. So if you guys just want to double check that you don't have the live link going as well as our hangout, that might help. And I'm wondering if that's where some of the kickback is coming from. So if you guys just want to double check that you don't have the live link going as well as our hangout, that might help. And I'm wondering if that's where some of the kickback is coming from. So if you guys just want to double check that you don't have the live link going as well as our hangout, that might help. And I'm wondering if that's where some of the kickback is coming from.
Would that be me?
It might be. I'm wondering if the tab that you tried earlier is the broadcast that's going live.
Would that be me?
It might be. I'm wondering if the tab that you tried earlier is the broadcast that's going live. It might be. I'm wondering if the tab that you tried earlier at the top of Chrome, because I know you opened Chrome.
Yeah.
If you close that one, it might stop some of that kickback feedback. At the top of Chrome, because I know you opened Chrome. If you close that one, it might stop some of that kickback feedback.
If I close the Chrome, I might shut us all off.
I know you opened Chrome. Do you have two tabs at the top, Jim?
If I close the Chrome, I might shut us all off. Did that help?
I think it did. All right, everybody. My name is Andrea Townsley, and I am a former fourth grade teacher turned instructional coach, and I am now part of the school improvement team at Grantwood AEA, and I will turn it over to Nick.
Well, good evening, everybody. I am Nick Duffy. I am the principal of Jackson Elementary in Cedar Rapids, and I am just thrilled.
Well, it looks like we lost Nick, and he'll probably be back on in just a minute. We're having all kinds of technical difficulties. So Nick was going to introduce Jim Sporleder, which I will jump ahead and I will do that. So Jim Sporleder has dedicated the next chapter of his life to assisting schools to become more trauma-informed and centers of healing. After 33 years as an educator and most recently as principal of Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington, Jim and his staff's pioneering work was documented in the movie Paper Tigers. Most recently, Jim, along with Heather Forbes, published an implementation guide for administrators and school personnel. This manual is designed to provide a step-by-step guide on how to turn any building into a trauma-informed school. Jim travels across the country speaking to school personnel about the trauma-informed care and relationship-driven culture. Welcome, Jim. We are grateful to have you here this evening.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be a part of the chat tonight.
Nick, I think you got cut off a little bit. Do you want to do your intro before we get started?
Sure, if you want to know who I am, I guess I can take that away. Yeah, Nick Duffy, principal of Jackson Elementary in Cedar Rapids. Boy, tech difficulties, I tell you. That's the beauty of a live show.
They're all over the place tonight, so I'm glad everybody's bearing with us, and we will surely power through this. So modeling that we're going to power through it. So I will get us started with the first question for Jim tonight. Reminder to our viewers, if you have a question for Jim, go ahead and give it to us on the IAedChat hashtag on Twitter, and we will surely ask that question for you. Jim, go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and your educational journey to where you are today.
Well, I started out my career as a special education instructor, and absolutely fell in love with that. Never felt that I would be going into administration, which I ended up going into administration. And but I had a real privilege to be hired by one of the middle schools here in Walla Walla, and I started my teaching career and went on to be the assistant, and then became the principal, and was in my 22nd year at Garrison Middle School, and really felt that it was my dream job. So not too many people know that it was not something that I did not want to jump on over to. It wasn't called Lincoln, it was called Payne Alternative High School. So took some soul searching, and report from a consultant who did an evaluation over our alternative programs in our district, and for some reason he stopped by the middle school and shared it with me, and it was a very, very painful report to read, and one of those things that just kind of caught my gut, and finally I felt like I was kind of being called, so I asked to be transferred to Payne, and then that's kind of where my journey started. It was probably one of the most it was the most out of control environment I'd ever walked into, to the point that I mean, my jaw was kind of taped to my chest. I couldn't believe the disregard for any authority figure, or staff weren't feeling safe, students weren't feeling safe, active gang fights, taking a lot of time from the police department on calls to the school. So my dream job started at Payne, and the goal was to bring safety to the kids, safety to the school, and self-worth to the students. And from there, Lincoln was kind of birthed out of that, and the journey began.
Fantastic. And of course, the name Payne eventually changed to Lincoln Alternative School that you were principal of when Paper Tigers was made and that documentary took place. So one thing that you put into place within that school at Lincoln was this trauma-informed model that we're going to be talking about, or trauma-responsive, whatever you want to call that. That's what we're going to be talking about a lot here this evening. But if you could just help us out and help our viewers out, what's the Reader's Digest version of this trauma-informed, trauma-responsive model?
Well, I think it's fair to say that 2/3 of my career, I was a traditional disciplinarian, had very good relationships with students, felt like my discipline taught, but felt that discipline was a choice, and that it was within the student's control. And once I went to a conference by Dr. John Medina, after my third year at Lincoln, I don't know how to explain it other than I got hit with a lightning bolt, and realized that my discipline was a punishment and that I needed to change. So the trauma-informed, that was my first time even being introduced to it. First time I'd ever heard of toxic stress. First time I'd ever heard that it was out of a student's control. And since we had been dealing with such intense behaviors when I first got to Payne, then Lincoln, it was quite a mind shift to look at a different way of approaching our kids. So 2010, there wasn't a whole lot out there. You know, we were looking for the curriculum. As you know, there's no curriculum, and we're looking for the program, and there's no program. And so we had some staff development wrapped around some mental health expertise, and we picked up a few concepts. In fact, it's the same concepts that I'm trying to teach today, and that is that these kids that are dealing with these toxic experiences, that we need to be able to drop our mirror, not take the behavior personally. We need to give these kids a chance to calm down, which in our traditional approach, we tend to react and tell. And as the research tells us, if we will drop our mirror, not take it personally, it keeps us in a regulated position where we're not triggering. That allowing those kids to calm down, then you can get to the root of the problem. And that's what we noticed right off the bat, is when we started asking and responding, kids started talking to us. And it truly was the fuel that kept the fire burning to want to learn more. These kids are just incredibly amazing. Their resilience, rather than wanting to punish, we were wanting to protect, because they started revealing what they were dealing with. And to be honest with you, it started with the very first kid I dealt with in the office. For me, as soon as I started asking, kids started telling me. And when you're working with a student who's dysregulated and you're able to remain calm, it's a teachable moment. And when you're allow them to come down to a regulatory state, that's an incredible teachable moment, where you can talk about triggers, talk about options, talk about their stress, validate them and their feelings. You're not validating the action, the infraction. But from that experience, when kids were calmed down and we had processed through those steps I just shared with you, what the research tells us is then that leads to relationship. And as that led us into a much deeper relationship with our kids, we gave the consequence, or we held the kids accountable for the infraction at the end of the conversation, not at the beginning. And most kids, when you've given them the time to calm down and process, and you've validated their voice, they're willing to accept anything that you give to them. They expect it. And right out of the chute, that's the response that we started getting from kids.
Thank you. Jim, talk to us about the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, research, and how this has impacted you as a building principal.
Well, we know the pyramid of the ACEs research. If you look at the pyramid and see that the adverse childhood experiences start right there from the caregiver, the ones who are supposed to be providing the love and the nurturing environment for these kids to develop the healthy brain and the neural development, that when they come from these toxic environments, geez, that pyramid, as we know, a score of 6 ACEs can take 20 years off of a person's life expectancy. And what I take from the research is if we took it as face value, we know it's more predictive of lifetime outcomes than poverty. It's only second to special ed. That if that was all there was to share, it'd be pretty hopeless. But the research tells us how we can turn this thing around and how we can turn these kids around and bring hope in their lives, and that's through a caring adult relationship. And the power of that caring adult relationship is priceless. It's something that we as educators have that not everybody has that opportunity. And so for me, that resilience that kids build through the caring adult relationships trumps those ACEs, and they can become the stepping stones to resilience versus being defined as a hopeless outcome as they move through life.
So I'm going to follow up a little bit with that, and as related to ACEs. And when you watch Paper Tigers, you can see a couple of your teachers at the time just talking regularly with kids about ACEs. And one of the scenes that I remember pretty vividly is Mr. Gordon, one of the teachers, polling the kids and how many ACEs do you have? And you know, the results that were displayed on that board were just mind blowing. You had, you know, 7, 8 kids in that room with 8 ACEs or more. But talk to us a little bit more about how that research came into play with your staff and how you use that on a daily basis with moving in the direction that you did.
Yep. You know, the one thing about Paper Tigers is on the students' specific ACE scores. You know, Jamie wasn't able to have his film crew there every day. It felt like it, but we actually gave our students a anonymous survey. So when we talked about the average ACE score for our kids, that came from a survey. In fact, kids could opt out if they wanted to, and we asked a lot of questions that provided valuable information to our health center as well. But we had over a 90% student participation rate. I think the lessons that you saw on Paper Tigers were taught more. That was a science class, a little bit more in isolation. I don't. Sometimes people think we have to know the students' ACE scores before we can help them. And I never once asked a student what their ACE score was. I asked them where they were in their stress, and that's all I had to know. From a 1 to 10, where their stress level was to begin the conversation. And if they wanted to reveal specifically what was causing that stress, you know, we certainly were able to address it. But I think I think we have to assume that all of our kids have that potential of being traumatized. You know, the kids that are acting out are the ones that we tend to think are traumatized kids, which many of them are, but we've got kids that are high achievers, not causing any behavior problems at school that are extremely traumatized. And if we don't focus on that caring adult relationship with every kid, it's best practice for all kids. You know, who doesn't benefit from a caring adult relationship? That keeps us from missing those kids. And so I would say, for me, in a trauma responsive school, we're consciously, intentionally creating positive interactions with our kids. And if one caring adult can change a life path, then why not put as many caring adults in that kid's life as we possibly can?
Amen to that. If one adult can change that life path, that's wonderful. Wonderful comment, Jim. So you came across the trauma-informed model in 2010. Talk about how your practices changed and what this entailed for you and your staff at Lincoln. But I'm also going to tag on to that. We have a question from one of our viewers. Mm-hmm. Would like you to also talk about some of the barriers for you and the staff. So maybe what changed, and then also what barriers you guys ran into.
You know, I think with trauma, becoming trauma responsive is not a checklist. It's not something that we do. I think once we truly understand it, it becomes who we are. So the more that we learned about trauma and the more we became more responsive, that created our culture. It created who we were. It created our identity. It's who we were as a staff. It's how we took care of our kids. It's how we took care of each other. It's how we took care of our families. That part kept growing every year. And I don't think the journey ever ends. My learning curve is just as high now as it ever has. And I'm learning all the time. And I think lessons learned for me outside of Lincoln have been the power of that caring adult, that these kids, we've got to keep them connected somehow. And for me, I have an outreach with my alumni kids. For me, I've got to figure out some type of mentoring program similar to what IAedChat is doing to keep my kids connected, so that there's somebody that can help them through the complex systems that we have out there. And the kids that have stayed connected to a caring adult seem to be doing pretty well. The ones who have faded away and have lost that connection, some of them have had some real struggles. And so some of the barriers that you brought up, we did not have 100%. We had some naysayers, but we had the majority. And I always say, if you've got the majority, you can move. And I wouldn't start unless I had the majority. And when I say majority, I'm saying 75 to 85%, because if you have too high of a percentage of naysayers, they can sabotage. And my experience is once that happens, you just don't get it back. It becomes something that we tried, we did it, it didn't work, versus that true embracing and understanding it's who we are. I wouldn't say that we ran into barriers as far as our learning. I'd say we ran into new learning, and it's the kids that transformed us, that gave us the motivation. If the barrier was there, it was that we wanted more. We wanted to learn more. We wanted to learn how to get to the problem quicker, how to help them better, how to surround that support. It's the motivator. Again, if it's who you are, you're always seeking to be better.
So you talked about not starting until you have that majority. What did that look like for your school to gain that large consensus? What did the learning look like for your staff?
I'd say when we first started out, I came back and made it clear that discipline was going to look differently. I used a lot of out-of-school suspensions, and I mentioned that that was going to look differently. That meant if a kid told a teacher to F off, they weren't going to have the automatic 3-day out. That was going to look differently. So there were some conversations around that, helping staff through that. But the bulk of my staff were relationship oriented, and so it wasn't that hard to sell, to be honest with you. The naysayers, yeah, they're harder to come along. And my take there is that you work with your teachers, you work with your staff. Baby steps are moving forward. It's when we dig our heels in and say we're not going to do it. I'm a little bit more blunt now in my older age, but I don't think we get a pass for that, because we know by not moving in this direction, we're hurting kids, and we're adding to the pain that they're carrying within. And I just don't think that gives us a pass. I see that as a barrier as I'm out training, is that some will, this isn't something that I agree with or whatever. And that's one of the misconceptions is that it's kind of like a choice. It's a choice whether to treat people in this approach or not. And to me, we're treating our kids, or we're wanting our kids treated in the same manner in which each of us deserves to be treated.
So one thing that you talked about a little bit earlier was the accountability piece and holding kids accountable. And you had mentioned that I am holding them accountable, but let's talk a little bit about that. So how do we hold kids accountable in a trauma responsive model? And how do you respond to those critics that are saying, hey, you're letting these kids off the hook? We need a pound of flesh here. I mean, so what's the response to the accountability questions?
I think I have to respond to that, Dan, with a question, and that is, how do you define accountability, and what's your goal? Is the goal to change the behavior? Do we want to see that student improve their behavior, or do we want to see the student punished? And I think that's a question that needs to be asked on the accountability issue, because if it's punishment, then it's about me, and it creates a me against you relationship with the student. If it's about changing and improving the behavior, it becomes relationship oriented, and it creates a me with you. I struggled in the beginning because I was so consistent on some of the suspensions, which I thought were major, the FUs, that when I started using in-school consequences, the kids helped me through that real quickly because they were begging me to suspend them versus use in-school suspension. And when I asked them why, it was, well, if I have to do it in school, it's boring. And so I always have to, there's some humor there, and that the kids really helped me through that, because they didn't want to do the in school. They wanted to do the out of school. And we stop and think about it. If we keep the discipline in school, we're holding the kids accountable for their attendance. And normally these kids have poor attendance. And I don't know of too many kids that come back from a 3-day suspension and ask for their schoolwork that they've missed. And so we're holding them to their attendance, and we're also holding them accountable to complete their work. But we have them in an environment which is safe. We have a nurturing adult supervising them. And to me, it's a win-win situation. And the research tells us the pound of flesh isn't working. It's failing miserably. I mean, we have the research that tells us that.
Absolutely. Well, shifting gears a little bit, but kind of sticking with our theme here, a trauma-responsive school is not just for students who have experienced significant trauma in their lives, but this benefits all kids. Could you explain that to us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, kids who are carrying these high scores of ACEs is called the silent disease. We only know a student's ACE impact is if they self-reveal, right? So when we get into trying to decide who's trauma, who isn't, or that misnomer that, oh, we have to treat the trauma kids differently. That's such a failure to these kids, because if we're not holding them accountable, if we're not teaching them the boundaries, we're failing them from my perspective. So when we're approaching these kids, and again, it's that caring adult relationship. We had kids that, you thought life might be going pretty good for them, that would, through the relationship, reveal something that they were dealing with that you never would have been able to know. And some of those kids were dealing with unbelievable traumatic experiences. If we look at our disciplinary policies, even nationwide, on under kids that come to school under the influence, or they're in possession of marijuana, we're doing 35-day suspensions on kids. And when you ask, how do you get these kids back? We don't. Who goes out and checks on them? Nobody. And yet, when you stop and ask these kids why they're using, and Dr. Folletti had shared this with me early on, and it took me a while to get my head wrapped around it. He said, Jim, it's not healthy, but kids are using because of their stress. And when I started approaching kids and just saying, I'm not judging you, but I can tell that you're using, and I can teach you some other options. I can hook you up with some support pieces that you won't have to smoke so much. Kids they'd always say, Sporleder, I'm not just trying to get ripping high. I'm under so much stress. I'm just trying to handle my stress, and really reinforce what Dr. Folletti had shared with me. And sometimes when the kids tell you why they're using, and then you find out what the stress is, it's overwhelming. And I can remember several times of just thinking, why would I ever put this kid out 35 days when he's suffering so? He needs to be with the family. He needs to be held accountable with some in-school work. And sometimes if they're under the possession, they still get the charge. They have to deal with the charge. But sending these kids out, oh my goodness. So some of the stories I've heard, they needed to be back with us. They needed to be with the family. They needed the support. And they responded to that.
Sometimes the school is the safest place for the student. We have a question kind of along the lines of what you're talking about right now from Andrea Smith. She says, what does that in-school suspension look like? Who is providing the support and the supervision? What does that look like at Lincoln?
Yeah, I can share what it looked like at Lincoln. It can look differently in different places. We used a classified employee for that position to staff it. I actually went after Shelley. I knew Shelley, and so I encouraged her to apply for the job. The person who is supervising that room means everything. I'll go to Heather Forbes' illustration of being sometimes a little bit Mr. Rogers and a little bit General Patton. That person needs to know when to be Mr. Rogers, and some kids need a little bit more time to process, but they also need to be able to say, hey, it's time that we get our work done. And Shelley was that person at Lincoln. She was able to process with the kids that needed to process a little bit more, but she also had built relationships that when she said, hey, it's time to get back to work, the kids respected her and followed through.
Thanks for giving us a little picture about what that looked like for you. The movie Paper Tigers does give a good explanation of what that could look like. So if you guys haven't seen that documentary, I urge you to take advantage of that, especially to see what it could look like in schools. Another question for you here, Jim.
Let me just let me add one
go ahead.
Real quick. On our in-school suspension room, when we were teaching about options and regulating and watching our triggers, we allowed our students to request self-timeouts. So students were able to come by. If they came by my office, they could say, Sporleder, I'm about ready to blow. I need a timeout. And then we could reinforce, hey, you're listening to your triggers. And so our ISS room was used with a lot of flexibility. It wasn't just disciplinary consequences. And then we saw our kids using it to self-regulate.
That's a great point. I'm glad you added that. And that's just teaching them that they can use that outside of when they are experiencing a trigger and kind of self-regulate on their own. So thank you for adding that. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about regulation. Talk to us about what you've learned over the years in terms of regulated kids and regulated adults.
I always say the biggest challenge we have today is we have dysregulated adults working with dysregulated kids. And I don't say that in judgment, and that's not a shaming of by any means. It's, our teachers are under such tremendous stress with all the mandates that come from our political leaders that don't understand the role that we have nor the environment that we work in. That's why I think it's so important that we get this information out to teachers to help them with the mind shift that needs to take place so that we can move away from that feeling of the stress, so that they understand it's okay for them to catch their triggers, to stay calm. Because once you learn, and believe me, I triggered in my traditional mold. And once you learn to put your mirror down, it allows you to stay calm and not trigger. And we know that a calm adult can get an escalated child or student to calm. We represent safety when we're calm. And it offers us a teachable moment. If we're dysregulated, we've lost that situation, and we've lost the trust and the start of a relationship. So a regulated adult is well prepared to help begin that caring adult relationship with those kids. Doesn't mean we don't see the blow-ups and what have you, but the kids know that we're gonna love them, we're gonna forgive them, and we're gonna teach them, and there'll definitely be some form of accountability for the infraction.
So in different interactions, we've heard you say that true growth occurs when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Please explain your thinking behind this statement related to vulnerability.
Well, I think any time that we change comes, and sometimes that vulnerability keeps us from taking that step forward. I guess I'll relate it to when I left my middle school. It was extremely hard. It was my, like I said, it was my dream job. I was hiring alumni kids. I felt very good about the direction the school was going in. And so for me to move out of that and move over to Lincoln, obviously I put myself in a vulnerable situation, but also had the greatest growth of my career in the 6 years I was there. And vulnerability for me, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, is we allow ourselves that personal growth that helps transform who we are, makes us a better person. And I think that happens through working with these amazing kids.
Well, you've talked, Jim, about the traditional approach to student discipline kind of being centered on fear and control. Could you talk more about this and maybe what student discipline should be centered around?
Well, the fear and control, I use that. So the more I've gotten into it, the more I realize how I used it. I thought some of the strategies I used for discipline were really effective strategies, but when I look back, it's how I used fear to manipulate the response I wanted. So, if we're using the fear to manipulate what type of response or behavior we want, what I learned is that when we miss the asking the kids, giving them voice, because it's giving them voice is what creates the relationships and changes the behavior, because these kids don't feel like they have a voice. I mean, we can say the same with adults and the same with teachers. Teachers need a voice. They need to be valued, and when that happens, that's when that change really starts to take place.
Well, I think we lost Andrea, but Jim, we have a couple of questions coming in from our followers. Eric Hoops asks, can you talk about the importance of educating students about the brain and the process the brain goes through when working through stressful events? Do you have any recommendations for teaching this?
First, I'll say hi to Eric. My daughter is a trauma coach for her elementary school, and she has really effectively used the zones of regulation, the brain states. She uses mindfulness to teach the kids calming techniques, and it's been amazing to see what she has used and what she's actually developed to see these little guys using the calm room or the breathing techniques that she's taught on the mindfulness. They start using those to self-regulate. It's a powerful model to look at. The older kids, for me, mindfulness was just coming on the scenes. I mean, I wish I would have had greater knowledge in that when I was in the trenches there. I could have used it better for myself, for self-care. So I would say those tools. We have more knowledge now, and we're able to use those tools as part of that teachable moment when these kids are dysregulated, and giving them good visuals and to let them understand more about their behavior and their brains.
That segues right into another question that we have from the audience, and I apologize, I keep bouncing in and out of this call. So if we've discussed this already, I don't think I've missed too much, but this question comes from Eric.
Yep,
is that the one you just asked?
Yep,
okay.
We did.
What
we
about
sure
the one
did.
from Lee? Did you get
Nope.
the one from Lee?
Nope.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and do the one from Lee. He says, how would you describe a trauma-responsive community working together outside of the school walls?
Extremely powerful. I'm fortunate that come from a trauma-informed community. Walla Walla has been recognized nationally as a trauma-informed community. And boy, when you've got your community partners that are working together with you in a trauma-informed with strategies, you speak the same language, you have the same understanding, and you have the same target in mind. And at Lincoln, I just saw over and over again where a family could be in crises, and the next morning we'd have the partners at the table that needed to be there. And before that parent left, you could just see this huge weight just fall off of them. And it sends such a great message to these parents who don't feel cared for, who don't feel they have a voice, and they see the community coming together around a crisis that they're in and coming up with real good solutions and support for the families. So I think it's the best. To me, it's the best model out there. Right now we're focused on schools because we want as many trauma responsive schools as we can get. But when the community, when it's a collaborative response to trauma, I don't think it gets any more powerful.
Sounds like a great place to be, Jim. As we wind down our chat today, we have a couple of questions that we like to ask all of our guests. So the first one that we're going to ask is, if you could change one thing within the landscape of education, what would it be, and why do you feel as you do?
This is my question, or for the? I feel very strongly, passionately, and it's hard to get me off my soapbox. I think the elephant in the room is high stakes testing. I think it needs to be addressed. I think the amount of stress that the system that's out of our control is putting so much stress that it's compounding. Maybe that's part of the barrier of trying to challenge our teachers to change the mindset, is because of the policy and mandates that have no research behind them. We know make no sense. Take recess away from kids to create more academic time because teachers are sitting around doing nothing. I mean, this craziness out there. And so that's my biggest frustration. And I guess that's a political battle that I'm willing to fight. I am fighting it here in Washington State, that kids are more than a test score. We've got to get back to the social emotional learning. We're not going to get the academic growth until we change our approach.
All right, Jim. So as we kind of close up here, we have one more question for you. And really that question is just, what's next for Jim Sporleder? What does the upcoming summer and near future look like for you?
Well, I haven't been chased out of any communities yet, so that's a good sign. kind of a direction, exciting direction for me is that looks like we're moving towards a lot more trainings out of the book. And I mentioned the book because of the simplicity of it, the how-to. It is the how-to, and we're training building principals and their leadership teams. So these are teams that are coming that have already started the journey or wanting to get the journey started, and it's just been real exciting for me. I met you. I can't go anywhere without walking away with new friends, being inspired, learning from others. It's just it's an exciting time for me, and we all, those of us that have seen what a trauma responsive school will do, you can't help but be out wanting to support the movement, because the kids need us. They need our voice. They need our advocacy, and they need us for that hope and that resilience.
So before I turn it over to Andrea for some resources, I'm going to throw a resource at you. So the book that Jim's referring to is the Trauma Informed School, a step-by-step implementation guide for administrators and school personnel. This is a fantastic resource. If you are interested in this work and you are interested in moving your school district toward more of a trauma responsive environment, I would highly recommend this book. We are using this in Western Dubuque schools, and it is a step-by-step. It really is of do this, don't do this, pitfalls to avoid, and things of that nature, implementation guides, all of that kind of stuff. You will want to check that out. Just tremendous resource, and digs in more to what Jim's talking about within the last hour that we've had him on. So do check that out. So Andrea, I'm going to kick it to you.
Sounds good. Thank you for sharing that resource. If you want to follow and make connections with Jim, you can find him on Twitter at Sporlin, S-P-O-R-L-I-N. He also has a website, jimsporlederconsulting.com. I'm going to give you a minute, Jim, to just give us any closing thoughts before I share some upcoming regional and national events. So take it away, Jim.
Well, I want to express my appreciation for the work that all of you are doing, and the group that's participating tonight. We're all on the same team. We all have our own gifts and talents that we bring. Everybody has a role to play. We need to be supportive of one another. It's not a hierarchy movement. It's a movement of support and collaboration. And I'm just lucky to meet some just incredible people along the way, and I'm very grateful for that. And again, I'm grateful for the work that I see. I guess I look at every community with Lincoln kids, as I like to call them, and I just appreciate all the work that's being done. And those
go ahead.
And those doing the work, I appreciate everybody.
We definitely appreciate you and the work that you've done. We know it's hard work, and we appreciate you sharing your journey with us. So I'm going to go ahead and share just a couple of upcoming conferences. KPEC, Keystone's premier education conference, Breaking Barriers, Challenging the Boundaries of Learning at the Grand River Center in Dubuque, is June 18th and 19th. BC Ed Camp, focused on teacher leadership, is at Benton Community Schools on June 21st with special guest Iowa Director of Education Ryan Wise. If you have local, regional, or national events you'd like us to give a shout out to or highlight on our live show, please send us a link and we will talk about it.
I'm going to wrap this up. So thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts on Iowa EdChat Live. Typically, this is the last Sunday of the month, but this was a special date that we had to have Jim Sporleder on. So typically, we're rolling with the last Sunday of every month that we will do a live show. And a very special thank you tonight to Jim Sporleder. So be sure to, we're so very grateful to have him on board here tonight talking to us about trauma responsive practices. But be sure to follow some of your new friends that you met this evening and continue to follow our hashtag at hashtag IAedChat to continue the conversation. You can also find a great deal of resources on our website. That is tinyurl.com/IAedChat. We are going to be off next week because it is Mother's Day. So make sure you thank all of your moms out there for that. So we will not have an Iowa Ed Chat next week, but we will be back May 20th with another great topic. Until that time, be the change. Good night, everyone.